Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma Daf Kaf Zayin. Today's stuff is sponsored by Ruth Leigh Kahan in honor of her husband David, who is currently in surgery, donating a kidney altruistically. I wish him and whoever receives it skilled surgeons and a speedy and complete recoveries. I am very proud of him. Today's stuff is sponsored by Ron and Shiur Krebs in loving memory of Shiur's grandfather Yitzchak Lev ben David Ber HaKohen V'Malka. Okay, we're going to get started with our situations here. We're in the middle of a whole list of statements of rabbis. So we ended with these cases. We'll go back 2 cases because I want to compare that to the case we're going to see now about someone who throws a vessel out from the roof, and then someone on the way smashes it. I always think of with a baseball bat, right? It could be with anything, and breaks it. And what do we say? The person. Right, there was a whole debate. We said there were 2 ways of understanding it, whether the person who threw it is responsible or actually no one's responsible. The person who threw it isn't responsible because they didn't actually break it. And the person who smashed it isn't responsible because they were basically smashing something that would have broken anyway. So it wasn't really worth anything. Now, and I will warn you, trigger, this is not a pleasant sight, what we're going to see right now, and particularly in light of recent events. When I used to teach this, it was more like, okay, this is a very crazy theoretical case, but unfortunately now it's the pain of what's happened in the last number of days or weeks, months, is to kind of whatever. With all that, I'll read the case. Amar Rabba Zarak Tinok Merosh Hagag. Somebody throws a child, okay, Tinok could be baby, it could also be a child, from a roof, okay, pretty horrible situation. Throws a child from a roof. We basically want to create a parallel case. Instead of throwing a vessel, throwing a human, okay? But again, we're going to go with a baby like we had before, because the children, it's clear, right? They're much less likely that they're going to survive a fall like that, whereas someone bigger maybe could survive it. Again, it all depends on how high up you are. Usually they were 2 flights up and it was all standard. So anyway, a very strange case. Again, what we're going to see, if you think this is strange, we're going to get to not as maybe offensive in a different way, but we're going to get to another crazy situation later. And in fact, the Yam Shel Shlomo says there that this was all just theoretical, and they're really just trying to get to concepts, right, about responsibility and where the responsibility falls. So this is actually going to be a plukta de Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera of Rabbanit. What happens in this case? So in the end, right, somebody threw, and I mentioned this movie Heaven Can Wait yesterday. I was a little rushed, so I can go through what happens there for anyone who doesn't know the movie. So it's a movie where Warren Beatty is a big very famous football player. And in the beginning of the movie, the first scene, as far as I remember, saw it many, many years ago, but it always made an impression on me. And I think of it always when we learn these sugyot. So he's going through a tunnel in a motorcycle, if I remember correctly, and he's about to get into a car crash, and they take him up to heaven. And he doesn't actually get into a car crash. And he says to them, but, what am I doing here when he gets to heaven? They said, you died. He said, I didn't die. He said, I could have avoided it. They said, no, we knew you were going to die. And he said, but maybe I could have avoided it, right? It has all sorts of ramifications, right? I have free will, all sorts of things. But the idea here is that basically the child didn't actually die from the person throwing him off the roof, right? Now, they would have died, but who knows? Maybe someone would have caught the baby, maybe this, right? It's tough to know what would have happened had the person in the middle not killed the child. So what's the situation? Okay, is the first person responsible? Is the second person responsible? Perhaps no one's responsible. And that's all because of a big debate between Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and the rabbis, which we actually saw not so long ago. Dear Tanya, it says in a Braita, Hikuhu asara b'nei adam b'asara maklot. 10 people, right, gang fight, or beating up one person. Bein bevat achad, bein b'zeh achar zeh, kulam p'turim. If while they're hitting him, they kill him, it doesn't matter whether they did it one after the other or all at the same time, they're all exempt. Okay, why are they all exempt? Because Rashi says, it says in the Torah, ish kiyakeh kol nefesh adam. You have to kill the entire soul of a person. And each one didn't kill the entire soul of the person. Each one killed 1/10 of the soul of the person. That's one way of looking at it. Other commentaries say, no, it's not because of that. It's because of nefesh tachat nefesh. So nefesh tachat nefesh means a soul for a soul. So if you say a soul for a soul, it means, and not multiple people. Multiple people are not going to get killed for killing one person. Right? You might say that's very unfair, right? If it was a plan by multiple people. But according to Torah law, we're going to have capital punishment when it's 1 for 1, not when it's 2 for 1 or 10 for 1. So basically, how does that relate to our case? So in our case, we're going to say, look, neither one is responsible because neither one caused the death alone. Now, it's not exactly the same thing because, right, theoretically, right, either the first one fully caused the death because he was dead anyway, or the second one would have because the second one actually caused the death, but it's still somehow this combination of efforts that caused the death of the child, and therefore we can't make anybody responsible. And again, you could say, going back to the movie, why did I bring the movie image? Because theoretically, each one could say, right, what the first one could say, hey, I shouldn't get the death penalty because who knows what would have happened. That's why it goes back to that movie. Maybe the baby wouldn't have died on the way. You think they would have, but maybe they wouldn't have. And the second guy can say, look, the baby wasn't going to live anyway. So I didn't really do anything. So the baby was going to die. It was on its way to definite death. So everyone can make an argument there. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, if all 10 kill him at the same time, and they all beat him up at the same time, you can't make them all responsible. But if you do one after the other and they beat him up, and the last one who beat him killed him, well, he made the death happen sooner. If you're going to say the one who made the death happen sooner, then you can actually obligate the one at the bottom. Okay, which is interesting because it comes out the reverse of the vessel, right? The vessel, we said it's breaking a broken vessel. But that's why, again, humans are different. The vessel was definitely going to sure death. A human, you never know what could happen, right? The child could do something smart, and we'll see later that there's a case where somebody's falling and they kind of move themselves over to a place where it's right as they're flying down. They kind of succeed in getting themselves to a safer landing, or someone could come and catch the baby. So you don't really know. Whereas a vessel, probably no one's going to try very hard to fit, to save this. Who really cares? We're actually going to see that later in the sugya, that the difference between the way people care for humans and the way they care for vessels. Because vessels can be easily replaced as opposed to humans, which we know are not easily replaced. So that's the situation. Now we get to, if you thought that was crazy, now Bashur v'kiblo b'karnav. Same situation. The baby's being thrown off the roof. But instead of a person coming with a bat, or with a knife and stabbing the child, we now have, by the way, I don't know if I translated, Ba'acher v'kiblo b'sayif means they took a sword, and kind of stabbed him on the way down. What if a shore is in the middle there, and before the baby hits the floor, the ox gores the baby with its horns and kills the baby? So now the question is the owner of the shore, does he have to pay a ransom payment? Because when a shore kills a person, there's a ransom payment. So again, is it the shore's fault the child died, or was the child anyway going to die? So plugta to Rabbi Yishmael ben Yosha, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Rabbanan. You get this. We keep going back to, it's a machloket there. It's a machloket there. We saw that yesterday also. The Evid, it's a machloket, Rashbag, and the rabbis. And each time it kind of conjures up, let's compare it. It's just like this other machloket, or not that it's just like, but if you look at that other machloket, you can understand how to answer this question. So here we have a machloket about the pidyon and the ransom payment. So again, a person shore kills a person. So the owner of the shore of the ox has to pay. They're really supposed to die because they caused the death of someone, right? Their property caused the death. But since they didn't do it with their hands, we don't kill them, but they pay a ransom payment. Right? If a person kills another person, he can't pay a ransom payment. But here, right, we had a whole discussion about that yesterday. So now there's a machloket. Titania, v'natan pidyon nafsho. That's the pasuk. You redeem yourself. So now they say, what does it mean? Redeem yourself on what basis? What value? You have to pay a value of a human. Now, there's two possibilities. Either the value of the person that was killed or your own value, right? You would think if you're paying a ransom payment because your ox killed a person, then it should be based on the value of the person killed. And that's the first opinion, to me, nizak. To pay the ransom payment for this person you killed right nowadays, that's what you would do. You would pay, if you kill someone, so you pay their family the value of that person again, however you could value a person. But that's for, lawyers to figure out. Now, by the way, in those days, it was very simple. You see what the value of that person is in the shuk, in the marketplace. They used to have slaves. They would sell people as slaves, right, for their labor. So that's how you would determine the amount. Nowadays, it's much more complicated. Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, Omer, demei mazik. It goes by, you're paying pidyon nafsho. that means you're buying your soul out of death. That means you have to pay the value of your own soul because you were supposed to die and you want to now redeem yourself. So it doesn't matter who you killed and their value, you go by your value. Now here, obviously, there's a huge difference in value to the extent that forget the child is worth less than an adult. But that's not the issue here. This child was about to die. It was being thrown from the roof. So this child actually had zero value in the shuk because they were almost dead. It's like we said, manatavira taval, you're breaking a broken cleat, right? It wasn't broken yet, but it was about to break. The baby was about to die. So basically, if that was the case, you wouldn't pay any ransom if it goes by the value of the child. If it goes by the value of the person themselves, the owner, then obviously they would have to pay the full value. So that's the machlok. Okay, now we get to another case. I'm a rabbi, and here we get to a very crazy, absurd case. You're going to be very shocked by it. This is where the Amshel Shlomo says, this is because of drush v'kabel sachal, which means learn the Torah to get rewarded, but this is not a practical case, okay? We would have expected them to say it in many cases that we've learned, right? We always say, it's a question, is this a theoretical, is it not? This is clearly 100% hands down a theoretical case. I'm just preparing you for what's going to be. Okay, the first part is not so crazy, but I'm a rabbi. Nafal merosh hagag. We're now going to have, just like you had the stone and you didn't know you had the stone and you stood up and it caused all sorts of potential things. So now we're going to have a case where somebody falls off a roof and two possible things can happen. So they're going to fall on top of a woman, okay? And the first part is going to be, and then they obviously damage the woman. So this guy is standing on the roof. He falls down. We're going to see in a minute that they're talking about atypical wind, okay? There obviously was no barrier on the roof. And the person was standing on the roof, falls down off the roof and lands on this woman and causes her damage. Now, since he was standing on a roof without any guardrail, and so much so that if a typical wind came and knocked him over, that's already not like the cases we saw yesterday. It's shogeg, as we talked about in the Ir Miklat, more similar to mezid, to intentional. And therefore, chayav ba'arba'ad dvarim. Now here, the arba'ad dvarim are not the same four as yesterday. Most of them are, but there we distinguish between nezek and the other four. This time, we're going to say you're liable for nezek and also ripoy, shevet, and tzal, lipoy, and shevet. You're not going to be liable for boshet because boshet needs intent, and there was no intent here. Okay, we'll talk about that soon. But now, here comes the crazy case. So, and I thank you for reminding me that we saw this in Yibum already. B'yivim to lo kana. What does this mean? If the man is unclothed and the woman is unclothed, and he falls on top of her and engages in relations on the way down without any intent whatsoever. I'm not going to get into how exactly this could happen. Again, it's a very theoretical case. What they want to distinguish here, and I think I mentioned yesterday that when we talked about the language of the Mishna, and we talked about Adam uad la'olam, ben shogeg, ben mezid, ben ones, ben be'atzon, we said those two words were missing. And it also says it in Yivamot, Haval Yivim To, one who has relations with his wife, with his Yivama, the one he's supposed to do levirate marriage with. It also says the same language, Ben b'shogeg, Ben b'mezid, Ben b'ones, Ben b'ratzon. It's yibum. However, they want to point out here there's a difference. What's the difference? In this case, there's no intent. Now, what does it mean, shkaga or ba'ones? It means that you didn't intend to have to do the mitzvah of yibum, but you did intend to have relations with this woman. Maybe you didn't know she was your yivama. You didn't know you weren't planning to do yibum, all that. But if you have relations with her, that's going to be yibum. But in this case, you didn't even intend to have relations. It just happened. So then that's not even yibum. Okay, yibum is a little bit different here. And that's why they bring a ridiculous case, but they bring it to highlight the difference between the intent needed to do yibum. Even though they say it could be shogeg, it could be honest, it still needs intent for the act of sexual relations. Without that, it's not going to be yibum. Okay, so now they're going to explain. Chayab, what's the four dvarim? Chayab b'nezek b'tzar b'ripoy b'shevet. Aval boshet lo. Why not boshet, the humiliation that the person suffered? That woman who got fallen on by this man? Well, ditnan, and again, we're not talking about yibum anymore. We're talking about the damage he caused her. Ditnan, eno chayav ala boshet ad she'yehem mitkaven. You're not liable for boshet unless you have intent. Now here, there's a question of what is intent. Intent for the action, intent to humiliate. There's a big debate among the commentaries, what level of intent you need. Here, the person didn't intend to even fall on her, right? He didn't even intend to fall. So the question is, at what point would he be liable in boshet? And it's not 100% clear. That's why there's a big debate among the commentaries about it. Ve'amar Rabba, nafal merosh hagag beruach she'ena mitzuya. A tornado hits. Okay, you're on the top of a roof where you wouldn't really fall off normally. Maybe there's a barrier there, but a tornado comes and whirls you up in the sky, brings you down onto the ground, totally unexpected. Vehezik ubiesh, and you caused damage and you humiliated this person that you fell on. Now, this goes back to the categories we saw yesterday. This is your classic unexpected. I wasn't trying to do anything, and I was even in a place where it shouldn't have happened. It's only because a tornado hit at that moment, or a hurricane, or something crazy, and a very strong wind, and therefore you're only liable for damages. You're exempt from the other four. Now, this is just a repeat of what we saw, but you'll see they're bringing it for the next line. If it was a typical wind, and then you damaged and humiliated someone, that's what we saw before. You're exempt for boshet. But now here comes why the commentaries also disagreed about what exactly the meaning here is. If as you're falling, you start turning over and kind of you try to aim for landing on this person, because you see as you're flying down, you don't have a lot of time, but you quickly make an adjustment in your head and you say, you know what, if I try to move my arms this way, I can a little bit soar, right, and get to land on this person. And now, what were you intending? Well, that's a good question. Probably you were intending just to have a softer landing. Now, if that's the way you understand it, that you move toward that person so that you'd have a softer landing, well, here you actually intended to land on them. Now, you didn't intend to humiliate them or damage them, but you did intend to land on them. That already is enough to make you liable for boshet. Some people say, no. You're liable for boshet if you tried to move toward them to actually injure them. If you just did it to save yourself, you wouldn't be liable for boshet. You would have to have intent to actually damage. And that's why you flip, to actually hit the person, which is hard to understand in the pshat here. But again, in terms of boshet, it does seem like, yeah, if you're just trying to save yourself, why should you be liable for humiliation? So again, there's a debate about how exactly to understand this. Now, where do we get this from? And you're going to see later in another minute, the Gemara is going to say, they're going to learn it from somewhere. And I'll already tell you now, because since you intended to damage, even though you didn't intend to humiliate, you're still liable for humiliation. That does sound like there's a need for intent to damage, even though here it's very hard to imagine that you were really trying to damage when you flipped in the air, or kind of guided yourself toward them. It seems like you were really doing it to save yourself. So it's unclear here. So now we're going to prove how we know this. And for this, we're going to read another pasuk, another little graphic pasuk. We have Devarim chapter 25, verse 11. Ki natsu anashim yachdav. People are fighting. Ish v'achiv. Two men are in a fight, fist fight. V'kerva eshet ha'echad latzil et isha. Comes the wife of one of them. She wants to protect her husband. So what does she do? Right, miyad makeu, from the hands of the one who's hitting. Shalcha yada. So she takes her hand. She stretches out her hand. Ve'chzika b'mevushav, and she holds onto she grabs onto his genitals. Okay, and that's her way of trying to protect her husband. So now she actually is liable for damages for what she did. So the Gemara says, the question is how, or the Breita says, we're going to quote right now, now it says she puts out her hand, and then it says, and she grabs his genitals. Of course she grabbed his genitals. In other words, if you just said she put out her hands bim mivushav to his genitals, then you would know that she grabbed his genitals. What else is she going to do? Right? So the word v'chzika is unnecessary. So matam l'omar v'chzika, that extra word v'chzika shows intent. So therefore they say, from here you learn that in order to be liable for humiliation, you don't need to try to be, she wasn't trying to humiliate him. She was just trying to cause damage. So as long as you intended to cause damage, and again, possibly some people take this too, even if you intended for the action, even if you weren't really intending for damage, like the person falling down and aiming to land on something softer, that could also potentially make you liable for humiliation. Okay, before we move on, I want to do a little bit of a summary, because we saw a lot of cases here, a lot of different cases and levels of responsibility. So now I want to talk outside and look at some of the Rishonim, not inside, but kind of talk about it outside, about the Rishonim and what they do with these cases. Because I mentioned in the beginning that of Adam Mu'ad La'olam, that we have a big question of if Adam Mu'ad La'olam, bein ba'ones, bein ba'ratzon, meaning even if it's onus is usually, right, totally unexpected. The question is, what if it's really unexpected? As we've been talking about a scale, right? Shogeg, more onus, more amazing, more onus, right? More intentional, less intentional. We had a whole gradation yesterday. But what if we're at the very tip, the very end, where it's really onus, mamash beyond your circumstance? Now, what case did we see that seems like really onus? We saw two cases that are really onus, potentially. One is the stone, right? That you didn't even know was in your lap, and then you got up and damaged. And the other one was the falling off the roof in a tornado, right? That's pretty unexpected. So comes the Ramban and he says, this proves to you that if you're ones gamor, they call it, complete beyond your control, you're still liable, okay? And that's what he proves from those two cases, from the most extreme cases, which seem to be incredibly extreme. Comes the Rashba and he says, no, we have this concept in general, ones rachmana patre, which is the Torah permits ones. It releases you of responsibility. If it's really ones, you're not responsible. So how does he explain this? He says that's not ones gamor, these cases, okay? It's not complete ones. First of all, you had a rock in your lap. So it's not like you didn't, it's not complete ones. And as you could have noticed it. And falling off the roof, so the student of Rabbeinu Peretz explains, why is it not ones? Because what were you doing on the roof without right? And a roof is already a place where theoretically you could fall, okay? And that's, again, you could debate this, but already you put yourself in a situation where theoretically, if there was a tornado or hurricane at that moment, you'd fly off and maybe damage something. So that's not complete ones. And therefore, he says these two cases aren't complete ones. If it was really complete ones, you would actually be exempt. Okay, and that's a big debate. The more interesting opinion, I think, is the Drisha, who distinguishes between ones when it comes to damaging a person and ones when it comes to damaging a vessel. And he says, because in others, right, either you're going to say ones gamor, you're either liable or you're not liable. He says, well, it depends what you damaged. And his theory is like this. He says, if you damage a kli intentionally, so what do you have to pay? You have to pay damages. That's it. So if we're going to make you patur for ones, then we're going to drop you to nothing. So you're actually going to pay nothing if it's really ones gamor. But in a human, if you damage a human, you normally have to pay 5 things. If we say ones, we're going to drop you, so we drop 4 and we leave you with nezek still. So everyone drops a level when you get to ones, but since there's nowhere to drop with the kli, you're going to drop to nothing. So when it comes to a vessel, you're actually totally exempt. When it comes to a human, you're still going to be liable damages. Now he gives a very technical answer as to why, but you could also come up with another answer, which is damaging a human is more serious, and therefore we still will make you somewhat responsible. So that's an interesting, very fascinating, I think, debate about, how we view our responsibility. What if it's, what if it gets all the way to ones on the scale, ones gamor? Are we going to exempt you or not? And some people still say that you are still liable. Okay. Amar Rabba. Nafal merosh no, not there. Amar Rabba. Hiniach lo gachelet al libo vamet. Okay. Rabba now says, you put a coal on someone's chest, and then the person dies. Now, what happens when you put a coal on someone's chest? A hot coal? They don't die immediately. It takes some time because the coal is, it might be hot, but it's not going to kill the person immediately. So you're exempt for killing them because why? Because the person has knowledge, good sense. They're supposed to remove it. You didn't intend to kill the person. And even if you did, it doesn't matter because they have a way to get themselves out of being killed. And they didn't. So it's their fault. Again, this is all a matter of, we keep discussing this. If you can shift the responsibility to somebody else, then you're not liable. I'll be dovanischa. But if you put a coal on his clothes and the person didn't remove the coal from the clothing, chayav. Okay, now why is this? Because the assumption is that when you put it on his clothes, the person didn't need to remove it because they said, okay, fine, you're burning my shirt. Okay, you'll pay me a new one. And this we're going to see right now in a Mishna, in 2 Mishnayot. Amar Rava, travayu tanani. So Rava says, Rabbi, you mentioned these things. I can show you they're both in Tanaitic sources. Alibo, putting it on someone's heart, ditnan, it says in the Mishnah, kavash alav letoch ha'ol, this is in Sanhedrin. if you put someone in a fiery furnace or something like that, or where you put them in the water and you try drowning them, the person can't get out. Okay, either they can't swim, or you put them in this area where there's a fire and you lock the door, or they're underwater and you push their head down and you don't let them get out of the water. Chayav, you're obviously responsible because you put them in this place and they've no way to get out, so you obviously caused their death. But if you push them into the water or into a fire, they could get out of it. We saw this recently with the eved and the fire, right? And the gdi, right? There was a slave there, and there was an animal there. So now yachola alot misham vamet, and they could get out of there, patur. And yes, this is also a bit triggering, this whole image. And you can get out of it, and you die anyway, then the person is exempt because they didn't cause your death, because you didn't get yourself out of the situation when you could have. Again, has to be that you could have, but if you could have and you didn't, then they're no longer responsible. So there you have a Mishnah that says exactly what he said. Bigdo ditnan, and here's a Mishnah about the beged. Cha et ksuti, shvor et kadi. If I tell you, go rip my shirt, go break my jug, chayav, you're still liable. I'm giving you permission to do it, but I'm obviously expecting that you're going to replace it. Oh, you want to rip my shirt? Fine, rip it. What do I care? You're going to replace it. And therefore, there you have it. People don't care about their objects that much. And therefore, they just know, as long as they get the value of it, what's the difference? Only if I say, this isn't relevant, but to our case, but it's saying, only if I say, rip my shirt and I will exempt you, then you're going to be exempt, but otherwise you're going to be liable. So that's the Mishnah, that these Mishnayot prove both the things that Rabba said. But now, by Rabbi, he asked the following question, with this will end our chapter. What if you put a coal on an eved, on a slave? So now, mahu kigufo dami or kimamono dami. We always have this problem with slaves, because slaves are considered the property of the owner. Are we going to treat it like kelim then? Or are we going to say, no, an eved has enough sense to know and take the coal off, because we're talking about life and death here and a human being who understands the difference. So he asked that question. Then he continues his question. He doesn't answer it. He says, Imtim salomar kigufo dami. If you're going to say, well, look, the eved has enough sense to understand. And if the eved doesn't take the coal off his chest, or if the master doesn't take it off the eved's chest and lets him die, well, that's human life, and kigufo dami. It's really like it's your own body. And basically we expect either the eved or at least the master to take it off. Sholomahu, what about an animal? Because again, an animal is still a living thing, but it's right somewhere in between an eved. It's not a human. So where do we put the eved? So where do we put the shore, the animal? So Hadar Pashta, he then answers, and this goes in line with the sugya we saw earlier. Sholo avdo kigufo sholo kemamono. We treat the eved like a person, okay? Meaning we assume, and Rashi says it well. Rashi says, Shayalo le'eved l'salka. The eved should have taken it off, and sholo kemamono she'ein bodat l'salka. They believed, again, that I mentioned this last time, that I don't know how true it is in reality, but they believed that animals didn't have enough sense to be able to remove a coal and save their lives. Like they didn't, or see a fire and not run away. So to me, it seems like animals do have good instincts for these kind of things, but the Gemara rules that no, they don't have the instincts. And therefore, if you do it, you're responsible, because you can assume the animal is not going to remove it. And therefore, you're going to be liable for damages. Okay. And plus it has the element, but it seems to really be the assumption that they won't take it off. Okay. With that, Hadran alach ketzarega, we finish our chapter, but I will say that the next chapter is really a continuation of this. And we really have to read the two Mishnayot, meaning the last one we just learned already, and this next one as a continuum, because you'll see immediately what the problem is. So our Mishnah sets up the one we just read, Adam muad la'olam ben shogeg ben mezi ben er ben yashem. Whether you add ben ba'onis ben b'ratzon. Okay, that means humans are completely and utterly responsible for their action. The next, right, and then it says, therefore, right, you're going to pay full damage. The very next thing, because it's not the very next thing, because we learned the whole Gemara on it, but in the Mishnah, the very next thing is going to be a case where someone is exempt. So it's very odd. First, you set up, you're always, always, always responsible for any damage you do. And then it says, oh, but you're exempt in this case. which is very strange. And it's trying to say that while we gave a very clear principle, there's a lot of exceptions to the rule. So here comes our case, very famous Mishna. I put a jug down in the middle of the public domain. And you come and trip on it, and you break it, patur, you're exempt. Okay? Gemara's going to ask, what? Weren't you supposed to be looking where you're walking? Right? Why aren't you looking where you're walking? This doesn't make any sense. You broke my vessel. We just said that Adam is muad la'olam. You break my vessel, you don't have to pay me for it? Crazy. So they're going to have a lot of trouble understanding this Mishna. And if when you tripped on my vessel and broke it, okay, I just had broken glass Friday night in my house, and of course I got glass, in my finger. Thankfully it didn't stay there, but I did get blood on me. Very likely when you break something, you get injured by it. So in huzakba, if you get injured by my broken cod when you broke it, the owner of the chavit, in a minute you'll say, wait a minute, what's strange here? We started with cod, we got to chavit, we're going to get there in a minute. But the owner of, let's just call it the jug for right now, the same as the cod, is liable for damages. So I now caused you to get injured because I left my cod in the street, you broke it, which we're not going to make you responsible, but I'm actually going to be responsible for damage that you got from breaking my cod. So not only do I not get the value of my cod, I also now have to pay you damages for my cod. Now, in terms of Adam muad la'olam, you could say, well, it was my fault, the whole thing, because what was I doing? Leaving my cod in the public domain, right? And which then caused a hazard and, caused you to get injured. And maybe that's why you're not liable for damages, but we'll get back to that later. Now the Gemara wants to start, and I recommend you read Shuli's article about jugs in the time of the Talmud, time of the Mishna. But the first thing that's going to bother them is something literary here. It's a very famous sugya, and it says, Patach bekad v'siyem b'chavit. We were talking about, I put my jug down, and then all of a sudden it says, if you get damaged by breaking it, the owner of the barrel, that's the definition of chavit, the owner of the barrel has to pay damages. Who's the owner of the barrel? There was no barrel. And Nanami, and we're going to see this in two other Mishnayot. Ze baba chavito, this we're going to see very soon. Ze baba chavito, ze baba korato. I'm carrying my barrel. You're carrying a beam, like a piece of wood. Nishbarach kadosh shel ze b'korato shel ze patur. If we crash into each other and my cod breaks, notice cod breaks, even though we called it a chavit before. My cod breaks from your wooden beam. We're exempt. Okay, why are you exempt? Because we both had permission to be walking on the street. Patach b'chavit b'siyem b'kad. This is the same as us, it's just the reverse order. It called it a chavit, and then later it called it a kad. Same thing. Utna nami at the end of our Masechet, we're going to see this Mishnah. Ze baba chavito shel yayin v'ze baba kadosh shel dvash. I'm carrying a barrel of wine. You're carrying a barrel of a jug of honey. Nistika chavit shel dvash. Now, even though a second ago we called it a jug of honey, now we say the barrel of honey. The barrel of honey gets a crack. So your honey starts dripping. Now, honey was worth more than wine, so I quickly spill out my wine, go and give you my jug. I actually can't say, give me the money back for the wine I spilled. I can only say, I worked for 5 minutes, pay me 5 minutes worth of work to help you, that I helped you. We'll get to that Mishnah there. The content doesn't bother, isn't interesting right now. Patach b'kad v'siyem b'chavit. Notice first it called it a kad of dvash, and then it called it a chavit. So Amar Rav Papa says, what's this all coming to tell you? Why does the Mishnah keep switching the language from one to the other? Hainu kad, hainu chavit. Kad and chavit are used interchangeably. Okay, why are we getting a lesson in Hebrew language, right? Lemay nafkamina, what's the relevance? Lemekach umemkar, for business. Okay, Amazon is a great way to give this example. I order something on Amazon, okay? And it's listed as some sort of item, okay? And it doesn't give the dimensions, let's say, right? And I order this thing that's called a barrel. And it comes in the size of a jug. And I say, but I ordered a barrel. And they say, oh, barrel, jug, it's all the same, right? Barrel also means jug. And therefore, you ordered a barrel means jug, and therefore you got your jug. And why are you complaining? And basically, no return policy, okay? You can't return it because that's what we talked about, right? In those days, it was more you went into a store, you paid for something, you said, I'm paying for a barrel, and then you pay the money, you come back a few days later, and the guy gives you a jug. Do you have any rights to say, that's not what I ordered, right? I wanted something much bigger. And they said, what do you mean? This is also called chavit. So the Gemara is going to say, well, hechidami. This isn't really clear, though. It doesn't make sense what I just said, really, because if it's a place where a chavit is a chavit, a barrel, and a kad is a kad, a jug, which is much smaller, halo karule. Well, the Amazon has no claim. There is no such thing. And lo tzricha, it's needed for the case, deruba karule lekada kada, ulechavita chavita. Most people call a kada kada and a chavita chavita. The ikanamu dekari chavita kada ulecada chavita. There are a minority of people use the terms interchangeably. Ma'u ditem azil bataruba. You might have thought that we follow the majority. The fact is, in money, you don't follow the majority. Remember why? Because you now got this kad, you got a kad, you really wanted a chavit, but you have to prove that when you said chavit, you really meant barrel, and you don't really have a way to prove that. Okay? I always used to use the example here of football. Okay, a football in America is an American football. In Israel, a football is a soccer ball. So it's like a word that people use for the same thing, but it can mean different things. So if you didn't say, a football, American football in Israel, then most people call it, right? And you could say, oh, why'd you give me a soccer ball? I wanted a football, right? And then that would be a good example because most people in Israel call a soccer ball a football and a American football, a football Americai. But, right, if you, there are some people who call a football a real football, what you think of as American football. So, you could use that as an example where you could see that language works like that. Okay, moving on. Now we really want to get to the meat and potatoes of the sugya, which is, why are you exempt? You broke my kad that I left in the public domain. Why are you exempt? Am I patur? Why? Aren't you responsible to watch where you're walking in the street? Isn't that your responsibility? And not to step on things and break them? So we're going to have 4 answers, but they're really 2 different types of answers. The first 3 are what we call ukimtas. And the reason why I like this sugya is we talk about ukimtas all the time, but this is a real good, clear case of what an ukimta is. Okay. So now, I should have mentioned also England, particularly in football. So I've lived in America and live in Israel, but you're right. In England, it's also good, right? They call it, the whole Israel is based on the British. So back to our sugya. So now, Amrei debei Rav mishmei de Rav. B'mimale reshut harabim kula chaviyot. We're going to have 3 ukimtas, which means that this Mishna wasn't talking about a regular case. If I left my card in the middle of the street and you stepped on it and broke it, you're actually responsible. The Mishna was talking about a case, when are you not responsible? If I filled the public domain with vessels, okay, hard to imagine this ukimta. That's why I like this example, because it's really out there. I filled the whole street with barrels and you had no way to walk but to step on them, okay? Or I filled it with, my kadim, my jugs, and you had no way but to step on them. Well, then you're not responsible because I left you no choice. Okay, the Gemara is going to say later that then it shouldn't be you tripped over them. It should be more that you stepped on them on purpose, because you can even step on them on purpose. If I gave you no other way, you'd still be exempt. We'll get back to that. Shmuel Amar ba'afela. Shmuel says it was dark out. The Mishna was only a case when it was dark. Again, both of these assume that if that wasn't the case, you'd actually be exempt. You'd be liable. You'd be liable for breaking my kad. Okay, if it was light out and you could have seen it, right? Shmuel says the reason you're exempt is because you couldn't see it, because it was dark. Rabbi Yochanan Amar b'keren zavit. It was right around the corner. I live on a U-shaped street, and it's a very dangerous street because as you turn the corner, you don't necessarily notice the car is coming out. And it's like that, right? You turn the corner and the kad is right there and you break it. You didn't notice it because you couldn't see. Your vision was blocked. That's why you're exempt. But according to both these 3 cases, a typical case of you breaking my kad that I left in the middle of the street, you're actually responsible because it's your responsibility to look where you're going. So Amar Papa, before we get to the 4th answer, which is a totally different answer, Rav Papa says, Lo daika magnitin ela o k'Shmuel o k'Rabbi Yochanan. The Mishnah really only makes sense according to Shmuel or Rabbi Yochanan, but which is really saying the Mishnah doesn't work like Rav. Why? And this I mentioned already. Di k'Rav ma'irya nitkal afilu shavar nami. It shouldn't have said you tripped if it's a whole thing was full. Even if you broke it on purpose, you'd be not liable because I left you no place to walk. So Amar Ziv Mishmei de Rava, Hu Adin Dafilu Shava. Says, yes, it says you tripped, but it also means you broke. And this is how we can read the Mishnah according to Rav. So why did it say tripped instead of broke? Because of the second part. The end of the Mishnah said, well, if you get damaged by it, it cuts you, then I'm actually liable. Well, that's dafka nitkal. If I filled it up, all chavit, and you smash it on purpose, okay, you're not liable because I left you no way to walk. But if you get damaged, that's your fault. Why? My time, because you caused yourself to get damaged. You smashed it really hard. That's why. You could have walked carefully on it, and not gotten hurt. So that's why it said nitkal for the second part. But even if you broke it on purpose in the first part, you're actually going to be liable. And therefore, katani reisha nitkal. That's why in the beginning it says nitkal, even though it really would include shafar also. Okay, so we resolved the Mishnah according to Rav as well. Even though, now why do I like to say these were good examples? Because again, it's hard to say that that's the simple reading of the Mishnah. Really hard to say. But they can't understand how we could possibly exempt you because Adamu ala olam, you're always responsible. So it forces them into a corner to have to say, right, no pun intended about the corner, but to say that we're talking about, right, some unique case, which means that any other case you're actually liable. And in fact, we're told right now, not yet, but in a minute, we're going to see that there were cases where they actually did obligate people for breaking other people's vessels in the public domain because they took these ukimta very seriously. And they said that clearly isn't what the Mishnah means. But now, before we get there, we're going to have the fourth explanation. Amalei Rabbi Abba le Rav Ashi. Hachi Amrei b'mar Rava Mishmei de Rabbi Ula. So Rabbi Abba brings the Torah of Israel, and he says in Israel, they say, now Rabbi Yochanan was also from Israel, but this is a different approach in Israel. In Israel, they say, in the name of Ula, people don't usually pay attention to where they're walking. The opposite of what our Gemara assumed. And maybe it was the difference between Babylonia and Israel, right? Talk about car accidents and people nowadays, walk with their phones. They're not paying attention to where they're walking and they trip over things and all that. And exactly, Medina, you had the same thoughts as me, which is, even before that, people weren't paying attention. People are very oblivious to what's going on around them. And because of that, now again, what does that mean? So what, you're not responsible? Well, again, this goes back to Shane Regel, right? What were you doing leaving your vessel? Like, I left my vessel in the middle of the public domain. I know that people don't pay attention to what they're doing. So it's my fault for leaving it there. And that's really what the Mishnah seems to be saying. Number one, it's my fault and you're going to be exempt from damages. And number two, I'm going to be liable for damages if you do get hurt from it. In other words, if you break it, you don't have to pay me because it's my fault for leaving it there. And if you get damaged by it, I have to pay you because it's my fault for leaving it there. So that sounds like the most simple, obvious reading. And it's interesting that in Bavel, they didn't want to accept that answer. And again, maybe it was a bit of a different perspective they had on things. And maybe people were more careful about how they were, what they were doing. And anyway, it's very interesting machloket, or a different way of understanding. And this obviously is a simpler reading. You don't have to say it's some unique, rare case. So now they tell us that Shmuel, there was a case where it happened in Harda, and Shmuel actually made people liable. You have to pay, which makes sense because he said only in the dark you don't have to pay, but if it was light, you would. So they say So Shmuel makes sense. It goes according to what he said. But are you going to say that Rava holds like Shmuel? This is a little weird. I don't know why it would be so hard to say that Rava held like Shmuel, but basically they don't answer the question. No, they do. They answer the question. They say, no, you don't have to assume that Rava held like Shmuel. You could have said the reason why Rava made them responsible could have been it was a unique case. Amar Papa, Karna de Atzre Haved, Kevan de Berushut Avde, Ibaile Liyune Umes. It could have been it was this corner area where they had, not that you turn the corner, but it was a space where they sold olive oil. And there, everybody puts their jugs outside. And when the owner has time, they go and fill everybody's jugs. And there you have permission to leave your jug. And therefore, if it was broken, they'd make you liable. Okay, but in general, you wouldn't be liable. And that's a different way of explaining why Rava made them responsible here. Okay, Shalach le Rav Chisda. Now we're moving back to this issue of Boshet. We talked about Boshet. We're going to get off on a sidetrack. It's going to get into a very fascinating machloket that we're going to deal with more tomorrow. Shalach le Rav Chisda le Rav Nachman. Rav Chisda asked Rav Nachman the following question. He starts off with what I know, and then he says what I don't know. I know that for humiliation, the amounts are like this. If you knee somebody, then you're going to have to pay 3. Libi'ita, if you kick somebody with your foot, 5. Lisno karet, there's different interpretations. We'll just go with Rashi. You hit with the saddle of a donkey, 13. That already is a lot more humiliation. Lepanda demaru, the kupina demaramai. What if you use the handle or the head of a hoe and you smack someone, on their, I don't know, smack them in the head with it? What are you supposed to pay? What's the amount? So shalach le, Rav Nachman says back to him, chista. Knas kamagbi bebavel. Humiliation payment is a knas, right? It's not paying you for something, an amount for an amount. It's a knas payment. We talked all about knas a while ago. I'm not going to go back there. But we're not allowed to take knas in Babylonia because we're not rabbis who have smicha like the ones in Israel. We don't have the rights to the jurisdiction to take knas. So why are you asking me questions about knas? So he says, I want to know the details of your case. So Shalach Le sends back to him, Dahu Garguta de Beitre. There was a well that 2 people shared to irrigate their fields. They took turns every day. Every other day, each one had a turn. One took the water on a day that wasn't his. The second guy says to him, hey, it's my day. What are you doing? Lo eshkach, he ignored him. Shaka panda demara machye. So the guy whose day it was, who wasn't getting his water, takes the hoe and starts smacking the guy. And he wants to know, what does he have to pay for the damages he caused? What's the humiliation paid? Rav Nachman says back to him, you got the story all wrong, the law all wrong. He should have hit him 100 times and not be liable at all because the guy was taking his water. And afilu lamanda amar lo avid inish dina lanafshe bimkom pseda avid inish dina lanafshe. Even if you think, even the one who holds that you can't take the law into your own hands, you can if there's going to be a financial loss. And now we're going to see there's a whole machloket. Can you take the law into your own hands? I think I mentioned that we were going to get to the Sugya in Sanhedrin. I forgot it's here. So here we have Rav Yehuda Amar lo avid inishtina lenafshe. Rav Nachman Amar avid inishtina lenafshe. Here's your machloket. Rav Yehuda says you cannot take the law into your own hands, and Rav Nachman says you can. And comes the Gemara and explains, if there's a hefsed, a loss, even Rav Yehuda will agree that you can take the law into your own hands. The only machloket is when there's no hefsed. Now here comes the opinions, the explanation, and with that we'll finish. Rav Yehuda Amar lo avid inish dina lenafshe dekeman delei kapseda lezel kamidana. Since there's no loss, meaning you're not going to lose, right? What does it mean loss here? Here the loss is if you don't water your field today, you'll get water tomorrow. It's too late. Your field will be ruined. But if it's not a loss like that, so go in front of the judges, let them rule. Rav Nachman Amar avid inish dina lenafshe dekeman de bedin avid lo tarach. Now here it's fascinating. He says since you know that you're right, then you don't have to bother to go to court. Obviously, maybe you're wrong about being right? It's a whole fascinating thing. But he says, even if it's not a loss, if you're sure that you're right, you can take the law into your own hands. Obviously, this is very dangerous. I'm going to leave this right now, and then we're going to see all sorts of questions about this tomorrow and trying to bring other sources to show either, yes, you can take the law into your own hands, or no, you can't take the law into your own hands. Okay, with this, we'll finish. And quick review, we finished with those cases of Rabbah about all sorts of accidental damages that get caused and what you're responsible for and where they are on the scale. Then we had the miniach etikat. First, we did the kad and chavit, and what do we learn from it? Business dealings. Then we said, that they could be interchangeable if you live in a place where people do interchange them. And then we got to these 3 ukimtot of the Mishna, or the fourth answer being actually you really are exempt because people are not expected to watch where they're going. And then we got off on the sidetrack, which led us to, can you take the law into your own hands? Wishing everybody a great day. See you tomorrow. So I mentioned at the end of class yesterday, I might not be teaching live tomorrow, but I am teaching live. So the class will go up at the regular time and the Zoom will meet at the regular time. See you tomorrow.